Hello, everyone. This is Ben Kelly with Endeavoring Orthodoxy. Thought I'd go live tonight. I don't have my family with me tonight. I had planned to go out and do something on my own, or actually with some friends tonight, and those plans fell through. And my wife, then, when I had those plans, she planned to go take the children somewhere else to see their cousins overnight. So I am here all alone with no kids, no wife, and decided I would just go live and see how this works. I don't really expect anybody to get on here and take a look at this, but somebody might watch it. What I want to do is I really want to talk about the doctrine of sin. It's my belief that a lot of the church is really failing in helping people understand the message of the gospel simply because we will not talk about sin. We won't talk about sin in a true biblical sense, but we won't get real with people when we talk about it. We like to kind of sugarcoat what the Bible says about human sin. We really like to lie to ourselves about what how sinful we are, or what whether or not we do good or bad things. And so I want to talk about this. I want this to be an ongoing conversation for us so that I can begin to really develop this theology that needs to find its way back into American Christianity, not necessarily just all of Christianity, but American Christianity for certain. We have to have this conversation. Otherwise, the church is just going to die here. And so that's why I am doing this. The book I'm going to be reading out of is Christian Theology by Millard Erickson. So it's got a nice title there. This is a great systematic theology. It's not as reformed or Calvinistic as my personal theology is. That's okay. I think this is a good representative kind of evangelical theology. Excuse me, this is the book that we use at my seminary to study systematics. This is a book that I know lots of pastors have on their shelves. And really, it's a great book to have, even if you don't agree with all the bits of it. I don't agree with everything in here. I question some of the things that he has in here, particularly when it comes to, you know, doctrine of salvation. I take issue with, Erickson's view on the atonement. Um, he believes in unlimited atonement, and I kind of find that his argument's a little wishy-washy, but whatever. I still think this is a great book. I still think it is worth your time reading. I think its thoroughness and its ability to interact with other other types of thinking, philosophy, anthropology, sociology, all this. Its ability to interact with other disciplines and then present the data as it is, and then really match that up against what does the Bible say we ought to believe about this. It's really great stuff. So I want to spend some time reading this stuff. So the book is Christian Theology by Millard Erickson. The drink tonight is Michter's Single Barrel Straight Rye. It's delicious if you've never had that. If you do not drink at all, don't worry, I'm not going to help. And somebody is texting me. I want to pay attention to what I've got here because in case my wife does need me or anything like that. So, anyways, all right, now it's just telling me on a different channel I've gone live. So here we go. So we're going to talk about first the nature of sin. What do we mean? What is sin? And so here's the chapter summary. It says the doctrine of sin is important to us since it affects and is affected by all other doctrines. Several methods have been used to study sin, but the analysis of biblical data provides the best understanding of sin and its consequences. So Erickson's going to look at the biblical data to help us understand what sin is. The causes of sin, character of sin, and results of sin may be analyzed through studying the terms of sin as set forth in Scripture. Sin is any evil action or evil motive that is opposition to God. So any evil action or evil motive that is opposition to God. Simply stated, sin is failure to let God be God and placing something or someone in God's rightful place of supremacy. Now that's a very interesting definition because I know a whole lot of Christians and movements and different types of theological understandings that seem to put humanity in the place of God, and that could be a real problem, especially when you have ideas of sin, that sin is only sickness and that there's nothing really wrong with you. It's everyone outside of you that's doing wrong. That can be a big problem. So let's get into this. The interrelationship between the doctrine of sin and other doctrines. I'm not going to read all of this. I have highlighted bits from back when I did read this book, so I may just talk about that. We're definitely going to read this beginning part, the interrelationship between the doctrine of sin and other doctrines. The doctrine of sin is extremely important and much disputed. It is important because it affects and is also affected by many other areas of doctrine. Our view of the nature of God influences our understanding of sin. So that's one thing we have to understand right away, is that how we view God is going to really affect how we understand our own sinfulness. There should be a relationship between those things, and they kind of almost work in an inverse way, and that really the classical understanding of sin has been, or of God's holiness leads to a greater understanding of human sin. So think of it this way: if we understand God's holiness like this, it's going up and it's increasing. Whereas we grow in our Christian spirituality and our, as we grow to be more like Christ, we more and more understand God's holiness that way. We understand it to be greater and greater and more holy. Inversely, we should understand that our sinfulness and depravity is even greater than we could ever imagine before. So there's a relationship there where God's holiness is going and becoming greater. Our sinfulness is becoming greater in the on the opposite direction. And so how we view, God influences our sin. And if our view of God is that God is some kind of magical sky fairy, or he's Santa Claus up in the clouds and he just wants us to sit on his lap and say, good little girls and boys, that's going to really affect how we view sin in our lives, to the point where we probably don't even see any sin in our own lives. So let's keep going. If God is a very high, pure, and exacting being who expects all humans to be as he is, then the slightest deviation from his lofty standard is sin, and the human condition is very serious. If, on the other hand, God is himself rather imperfect, or if he is an indulgent, grandfatherly type of being, and perhaps a bit senile, so that he is unaware of much of what is going on, then the human condition is not so serious. Thus, in a real sense, our doctrine of sin will reflect our doctrine of God. So that's just what I said. Our doctrine of God will be exactly related to our doctrine of sin. And if we don't have a high view of God, we probably have a much higher view of ourselves, and those things are going to be much closer than they probably ought to be. So let's see, next paragraph. Our understanding of humanity also bears on our understanding of sin. If intended to reflect the nature of God, a human is to be judged not by comparison with other humans, but by conformity to a divine standard. So, did you catch that? So, how we view humans, or each other, how we view ourselves, is going to be affected based on our understanding of sin. If we believe our nature is to reflect the nature of God, and we're to be judged, according to his standard, well, that's much more serious than if we're just being judged compared to others. It's much more easy to say I'm without sin if I'm comparing myself to the classical example of Hitler. We use Hitler all the time in philosophical and theological discussions about how, he's just an example of evil. But, that's easy to compare ourselves to. But if we were comparing ourselves to a holy and perfect being, well, that's much more difficult. Any failure to meet that standard is sin. If humans are free beings, that is, not simply determined by forces of nature, then they are responsible for their actions, and their shortcomings will be graded more seriously than if some determining force controls or severely limits the capability of choosing and doing. So if we have a measure of free will, and even Calvinists believe that we do have a measure of free will, okay? So don't, if you're not a Calvinist, don't be like, oh, Calvinists are all determinists. They're not. We can talk about that pretty easily when we talk about compatibility and incompatibility as far as human free will and God's sovereignty. So we could do a whole discussion on that. But usually Calvinists would call themselves compatibilists, that humans can have free will while God is totally sovereign. And so a lot of people will call Calvinists determinists in that point, and which is it's just not true. No thinker has ever really, except people who are of the other direction, more than Arminian have been. They really want to paint that deterministic, label on a more Calvinistic kind of thinking. But I mean, even Augustine thought like this, and so this thinking is not just of Calvin. This goes back pretty far, and so there, Calvin's in good company and thinking like this, that God has very high, sovereignty, and He directs things as He wants. But humans also have free will to a measure. So it changes our view of sin, of how we look at free will and how we look at how much God, guides history as it is. And so, people who think that God is a determining God who directs people just to do what He wills. Some people might even go so far as to say that He causes people to sin, which no Orthodox Christian should believe. That's not that is not Orthodox at all. No one believes that God causes people to sin. He permits people to sin, but He does not cause them to. But if there were, non-Christians or philosophers out there that said, oh, God causes people to sin, well, then you're going to have a very low view of what human sin actually looks like. You're going to think it's not really that big of a problem. On the other end, if you really embrace human free will and responsibility, you're going to have, and again, this is all Christians, because again, Calvinists or Lutherans who do believe in a very high view of God's sovereignty as well, they believe in human free will. They explain it differently than, say, like an Arminian would, or a Molinist, which is a kind of a Roman Catholic counter-Reformation theology. They understand human free will differently, but they all believe in human free will to some measure. And so if you believe in that doctrine, if you believe in that human free will, then it's going to change how you think about human responsibility for sin as well. If people don't have free will, well, how can they be held responsible for their sin? If they do have free will, well, then they're really left without excuse. So that's what Erickson is talking about here. And already I can tell 15 minutes into this, this is going to take a long time to get through any measure of this chapter. So, our doctrine of salvation will be strongly influenced by our understanding of sin. For if a human is basically good, with intellectual and moral capabilities essentially intact, then any problems with respect to his or her standing before God will be relatively minor. Any difficulty may be merely a matter of ignorance, a lack of knowledge as to what to do or how to do it. In that event, education will solve the problem. A good model or example may be all that is needed. On the other hand, if humans are corrupt or rebellious and thus either unable or unwilling to do what is right, a more radical transformation of the person will be needed. Thus, the more severe our concept of sin, the more supernatural the salvation needed. So that's a very good point, and really brings me to why I want to talk about these things, and why I think it's important that we talk about sin in evangelical theology today, because so many churches and so many pastors, so many young Christians are moving towards this idea that sin is sickness. It's caused by people outside of the individual. The individual is not rebellious. The individual is not hateful in any way. It's more of a problem of broader society and outside forces coming in. That view of sin does not require radical transformation. That view of sin requires therapy, counseling, feel-good messages from a weak pulpit. It doesn't require taking on a new nature in Christ. Where the Bible says, I've been crucified with Christ, and it is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. The more severe our understanding of sin, the more radical the spiritual transformation has to be. And that's why the Bible says, I've been crucified with Christ. I have been transformed. It's not my nature, my sin nature that lives in me anymore. It is Christ's nature. And that's why Christians have always said it is the Spirit of God who indwells us and lives within us. It's the Spirit of God who really takes on our nature in that way. And so that's important, because the way I see sin talked about today is not this. It doesn't require radical transformation. It doesn't require confession. It doesn't require repentance. It doesn't require Jesus. The sin that a lot of churches are using today requires therapy and hand holding and crying. And I'm sure a lot of people are hurting. I don't doubt that. I don't want to downplay people's emotional experiences. I know they're very real. But that's not how you deal with sin. That's not even the right way to think about sin. Sin cannot just be something that is done to you. You have to look at yourself and understand that there is something wrong with me. But the world out there, they're telling us this lie, and a lot of pastors are doing this now. A lot of the church has been doing this for a long time. Look inward, look deeper. You'll find your true self, and that'll make you satisfied with God. That is heresy. That is a lie, and it's leading people down the wrong path, because we're not talking about how depraved we are, how sinful we are, and the radical transformation we need in Christ. So that gets us really at the heart of the matter of what we're talking about here. So one's understanding of sin is also important, because it has a marked effect upon one's view of the nature and style of one's ministry. If humans are considered basically good and inclined to do what God desires and intends for them, the message and thrust of ministry will be positive and affirmative, encouraging persons to do their best to continue in their present direction. If, on the other hand, persons are viewed as radically sinful, then they will be told to repent and be born again. In the former case, appeals to fairness, kindness, and generosity will be thought to be sufficient. In the latter case, anyone who has not been converted will be regarded as basically selfish and even dishonest. So I've seen this. Like, I was talking to a friend of mine a couple nights ago at a small group, and talking about a church that we both know, and how he was at a group with some people of this church, that in this church we question, its teaching, we question its presentation of the gospel. And he said when he met with a larger group of people, we're talking like more than 20, the people loved the church because it was a safe space. Now, what does that mean? I just got a big old siren going off out there. Sorry about that if you can hear it. So the church, this this group of people, this community had become a safe place for these people to be. Now, what does that mean? Now, I don't want to say that the church is not a safe place. I think it is a place where it's okay not to be okay, that um, Christians should very much talk about how we are sinners, and it's because of the grace of God that we have salvation, that we have been covered in the blood of Christ. But when we talk about safe spaces, it usually leads me to think we're talking more about the cultural idea of safe spaces, the just the idea that there's everything is going to be tolerated, nothing is going to be, you know, put off and told to go away. Everything is going to be accepted. Nothing is going to be judged, even from a biblical manner. And so when I was talking to my friend about this idea that we have safe spaces, this church has become just a safe space where I feel so safe and so protected. That's dangerous, because when you have a church like this, that means people can be safe in hiding their sin. People can be safe in directing their sinful nature towards something else that they really don't have to be confronted about their shortcomings. That's a problem. See, when Erickson just talked about this, if humans are considered basically good, and let's be honest, when we talk about safe spaces, especially in the culture today, humans are basically good except for those bad, um, white Christian males. Let's be honest about it. Everybody else is basically good except for those guys who are, me, for example. Um, Everybody else is basically good. And those other guys are systematically oppressive, and so they're obviously sinful. If you have a view of sin like that, what do you need Christ for? You don't. You don't need him. You just need positive thoughts. You just need, positive messages, good feelings, right? Happy emotions. You don't need radical transformation. But if your view of sin is, I am wretched, I can do no good on my own, that's going to change entirely how you think about sin and about the gospel. It's going to change the urgency. If I think that I'm basically good and that everybody else is basically good, what urgency do I have to share the gospel message with my neighbors? I have none. If if I think that I'm basically good inside, what urgency do I have to penitence, to penance, to review my sin, to confess it, to repent? I have no urgency to do that because I don't think I have any sin if I think I'm basically good. But if I view myself, I believe I'm regenerate, but if I still view myself as there is much that is still being worked out of me, that the Spirit of God is still getting out of me, and that the more I learn how holy God is, the more nasty and ugly I am, there's going to be a lot of urgency to seek God in prayer, to seek what His will is in the Scriptures, to have other people hold me accountable, to really do the things that the Christian community has called itself to do for the last 2,000 years. You see the difference there? There's a huge difference. One is being a Christian. One is not. One is lying to yourself and saying you are something you're not. So let's keep moving on here. So we're going to talk a little bit about the difficulty of discussing sin. So we just finished that sec. I mean, I didn't read the whole section, but we talked about the interrelationship between the doctrine of sin and other doctrines. That should be pretty easy to see. The difficulty of discussing sin, as important as the doctrine of sin is, it is an easy topic to discuss in our day for several reasons. Or it is not an easy topic to discuss in our day for several reasons. One is that sin, like death, is an unpleasant subject. We do not like to think of ourselves as bad or evil persons. That we just made that point. Yet the doctrine of sin teaches us that this is what we are by nature. Our society emphasizes having a positive mental attitude. To speak of humans as sinners is almost like screaming out a profanity or obscenity at a very formal, dignified, genteel meeting or even in church. It is strongly disapproved. This general attitude is almost a new type of legalism. The major prohibition of which is, you shall not speak anything negative. So, that's, he's actually, Erickson is actually in that, and this is a book I've come into contact with, and it'll kind of, it tells you a little bit about why I want to talk about it, because I've read about this book in other books. I have not read it myself, but Erickson gives a footnote to a book called Self-Esteem, The New Reformation by Robert Schuller from the 1980s. Schuller's book is a book I've seen before many times. Why? Because I like to read about how psychology is being used to co-opt our ideas of religion in our culture today. In fact, if you look back in some of my videos, you've seen that I just read Psychology as Religion by what was it, Paul Vince? Oh, I can't remember. Paul Vitz, I think is his name. The Roman Catholic psychologist. He understands the gospel, but he is very worried about how psychology comes in to change our views in religion. And we very much see this today, where it's you're almost looked down on to talk about people as sinful. And it's funny. I work in public schools. I've worked in public schools for the last over 3 years, almost 4 years now. And children are bad. I mean, you don't have to teach children to sin. All right. And if you disagree with me, you need to have your own children, spend time with them. You don't have to teach your children to lie. You don't have to teach your children to hurt their siblings. You don't have to teach your children to be dishonest with you, to take, to steal. They know how to do it right away. And what is interesting about it, especially when I worked in middle school, and kids were just terrible sometimes. And, teachers, they're just, a lot of these teachers who are humanistic in their thinking, they're not in any way religious or Christian. Like, I just can't believe these children are just so bad. And I would just say, I can. And I would really catch teachers off guard when I say that. And they look at me like I've got, 4 heads. And I'm just like, well, as a Christian, I believe that we are born sinful, that we're born evil and rebellious towards a righteous God. And so it doesn't surprise me that they act this way. It doesn't surprise me that they lie, that they cheat, that they steal, that they try to hurt each other, that they fight. It doesn't surprise me that they try to lie to their teachers, that they hate authority. They're unregenerate. Why would I be surprised by that? They're sinful and they don't have the Spirit of God in them. If we really believe what the Christian doctrine and what the scriptures teach about sin, we'll know that only a radical transformation can change that. We have to be radically transformed by the blood of Christ. And then that sin has to be worked out over a process of sanctification through the working of the Holy Spirit. That shouldn't surprise us, but it does some people. Another reason it is difficult to discuss sin is that to many people, it is a foreign concept. Now, this is a little more excusable. With the problems of society blamed on an unwholesome environment rather than sinful humans, A sense of objective guilt has become relatively uncommon in certain circles. Guilt is understood as an irrational feeling that one ought not to have. Without a transcendent theistic reference point, there is no one other than oneself and other human beings to whom one is responsible or accountable. Thus, if our actions harm no humans, there is no reason to feel guilt. This is becoming more and more of a problem because what we see, again, if there is no objective, transcendent moral value, moral command, then I am standing at the center of the universe, and what I say goes. So that can be a real problem because our only value becomes I can do whatever I want as long as I don't hurt anyone. I can do whatever I want as long as it doesn't interfere with other people. And the problem is that it always ends up interfering with other people. Further, many people are unable to grasp the concept of sin as an inner force, an inherent condition, a controlling power. People today think more in terms of sin, that is, individual wrong acts, and I think that's wrong too. I can go into why later. Sins are something external, concrete, logically separable from the person. On this basis, one who has not done anything wrong, generally conceived as an external act, is considered good. So, again, and this is big in our culture today, sin is something that comes at us externally. It comes from the outside. It's never a problem within me. It's always someone out there. That's that's not the biblical sense of sin. So, and I believe a lot of pastors would biblically say, yes, Ben, what you're saying is right. We don't believe in the external forces of sin necessarily as the major contribution of sin. Now, of course, there is sin. There are things that are done to us. But what I find is that a lot of these pastors will focus more on the things done to us and never cause people to look internally and say, where am I messed up? What have I done wrong? How have I sinned? That's the problem. So one more quick section here, then I'm going to take a brief break, make some tea for myself. Methods of studying sin. The topic of sin can be approached and studied in a number of ways. One is the empirical or inductive approach. One can either observe the actions of contemporary human beings or examine the deeds of biblical persons and then make generalizations regarding their behavior and the nature of sin. A second approach is the paradigm method. One could select one type of sin or one term for sin and set it up as our basic model of sin. We would then analyze other types of sin or terms for sin which reference this basic model, regarding them as varieties or elucidations of our paradigm. A third approach begins by noting all the biblical terminology for sin, and this is the approach he's going to use. A wide variety of concepts will emerge. These concepts are then examined in order to discover the essential element of sin. This basic factor may then be used as our focal point as we endeavor to study and understand the nature of specific instances of sin. This will largely be the approach followed in this chapter. Just like I said, this is going to be the approach. So what Erickson is going to do, what I'm going to do when I come back from my brief break here, so you'll just have to go forward a few minutes, or if you do hop on here, I don't know if anyone's even watching. I'm going to take like a 3-minute break and make myself some tea, but we're going to talk about the different terms that the Bible gives as sin, as sinful behavior, sinful thought, whatnot, and then we're going to try to pull out the main element of those terms. So I'll be right back. Go ahead and take a break yourself, and we will be back in just a minute. All right, everyone, I'm back. Ready to talk about some terms for sin. And as I was coming back in here, I was reflecting on my voice. I don't have a particularly strong voice. It usually gets weak pretty quickly. I've had some form of acute asthma and allergy problems my entire life, just about. And I've always wondered, man, I want to be a pastor and I want to preach multiple sermons every Sunday and do a few more during the week. And it's like, how's my voice ever going to hold up? I think of guys like um, Spurgeon, for example, who, you know, preach in these huge, huge sanctuaries, and their voices had to be so loud. And he talked about how he smokes cigars all the time. It's like, how do you do that? How can your voice hold up with something like that? I don't know. I find it amazing that some people have that, and I just don't. I'm weak, and so it just if God is going to use me, it's going to have to be the Spirit that speaks through me and gives me the strength. So let's talk about Erickson's terms for sin real quick here. So terms emphasizing causes of sin. The Bible uses many terms to denote sin. Some focus on its causes, others on its nature, and still others on its consequences. So that's going to be really important here. We're going to talk about causes for sin. We're going to talk about the nature of sin, like the kind of being it is. And then we're going to talk about just different what is it? Oh, consequences of sin. So consequences are obviously different than something's nature, what it is. Consequences are obviously different than causes, and that's why when we talk about like moral theory, when we talk about ethics or morality, we can't just base all of our ideas on consequences. We have to talk about other things. So some terms for sin. Hmm. Let's see, one of them here is ignorance. One of the New Testament words stressing a cause of sin is, my Greek is terrible. It definitely was not my focus in seminary, but agnoia, a combination of the Greek verb meaning to know, and the oh gosh, I'm not even going to go into it. The alpha privative. It is related to the English word agnostic. All right, so he's got a bunch of Greek information there that and then also some Hebrew, and I'm even worse at Hebrew than Greek. So languages were not my strong suit in seminary, so I was much more into philosophy. So this word is often used in settings where it means innocent ignorance. Some things done in ignorance were apparently innocent in the sight of God, or at least he overlooked them. Yet at other points, ignorant actions seem to be culpable. And Ephesians 4:18 says of the Gentiles, they are darkened in their understanding and separated from the life of God because of the ignorance that is in them due to the hardening of their hearts. Two passages, Acts 3:17 and 1 Peter 1:14. It is questionable whether the ignorance is culpable or innocent. Let's see, he talks about in the former, however, Peter's immediate appeal to his hearers to repent would suggest responsibility. So there's this idea in the Bible that there is some kind of ignorance, that sin is at some point ignorance, and then in some places people are culpable for their ignorance. These errors or ignorances apparently were such that people were liable to punishment for them, and this was willful ignorance. And so that's something very near and dear to my heart. I wrote my master's thesis on Romans 1:18 through 20, talked about how people kind of hid the knowledge of God, or they knew enough about God just from nature that they could recognize certain things about God, but they willfully suppressed those things so that they could go on living as if there was no God. And so it wasn't the exact point of my thesis, but it was something that came up a lot. And so that's what we have here. And it looks like, oh, I've got some people watching here, so that's kind of neat. Welcome, everybody. I see, oh, Alex is on here. Hello, Alex. All right. And then error. So another form, an idea for sin or a term for sin is error. And more abundant are references to sin as error, that is the human tendency to go astray, to make mistakes. Let's see, again, I'm not going to go through the Hebrew on this just because it's too much, and I'm bad at it. So let's see, a particularly clear example is found in 1 Samuel 26:21. Saul sought to kill David, but David was spared, has spared Saul's life. Saul says, I have sinned. Come back, David, my son, because you consider my life precious today. I will not try to harm you again. Surely I have acted like a fool and have been terribly wrong. And so what does he say here? He says that he just talks about it being an error. There's a lot of Hebrew here. So we're going to talk, I mean, we're just going to, so we've got ignorance and error as far as sins go first. And these are, I would say these are more causes to that. Yes, these are causes of sin that we have here so far. And the last one he really talks about is inattention. Another scriptural designation for sin is inattention. In classical Greek, the word, parakoe, again, guys, my Greek is terrible, has the meaning to hear amiss or incorrectly. And that's, several New Testament passages that refers to disobedience as a result of inattention. So it's you disobey God or one of his moral commands because, hey, you choose to not pay attention to what you're supposed to be doing. So these are causes to sin. These are things that we can take part in, obviously, that really cause us to sin, whether it's ignorance or some kind of error in thinking or inattention. These missteps can lead us into sin. And so now he's going to talk about terms emphasizing the character of sin. One is missing the mark. Probably the most, and this is how I talk about sin all the time. You've heard me talk about it this way. When I was earlier on the live stream here, I was talking about it as missing the mark. Probably the most common of these concepts that stress the nature of sin is the idea of missing the mark. The Hebrew views, let's say the Hebrew verb and its cognates appear about 600 times and are translated in the Septuagint by 32 different Greek words. The most common rendering by far. Oh gosh, I can't even. No, I'm not even going to try to read the Greek there. I can't. Again, my Greek is terrible, and I just can't put it all together. If it's a big word, I just have trouble. So the phrase missing the mark usually should suggest a mistake rather than a willful, consciously chosen sin. In one instance, let's see, the word family constitutes the most prominent New Testament terms for sin. It is used far more frequently, and there are almost 300 occurrences of this idea of sin within the New Testament. This sin is always against God, since it is a failure to hit the mark he has set as his standard of perfect love, and as it requires perfect obedience to him. And so what that means is God has this standard, and I talked about this earlier. The more we understand the holiness of God, and our understanding grows over time, and as He becomes more holy, the more we will understand how just wretched and depraved we were in our life, and the Spirit is working out more and more sin out of us and away from us, and so we begin to see just how much we have missed the mark. When we're new Christians, we understand that there may be a few instances where we understand that we miss the mark. And as we grow and we understand God's holiness more and more, we understand that, oh man, we've missed the mark a lot. God, we understand over time, over the Christian life, at least we should, God is more and more holy as um, as we grow. And then we understand that we've missed the mark more and more as we grow as Christians. And that's what it means to miss the mark. That is the the most prominent way the New Testament talks about sin is missing the mark. Let me see here. Another way that Erickson talks about sin is irreligion. So he says sin is also designated irreligion, particularly in the New Testament. Again, more Greek here. This is meant to be ungodliness as irreverence. And so, what do we mean by that here? I didn't read this before I came in here. I read this years ago, but I just wanted to jump on and give you guys some information since I just kind of decided to do this tonight, record this and do it as a live stream. Yeah, ungodliness as irreverence is how we're going to look at irreligion. So, cultic practices, really, in the New Testament does talk about this. But these are not very common. There are two basic senses. Paul uses this. Let's see. Peter uses this. Paul says, there's just a lot of Greek in here. I don't want to go over it too much. I really should have prepared this one more because, yeah, okay. It's considered as looking at Mosaic standards, breaking the law of God in a broader sense. So it's this idea of not worshiping God as he ought to be worshiped, that it's irreligious, that it's worshiping something else in the place of God. Another use is transgression. This appears 600 times in the Old Testament. It literally means to cross over or pass by in a literal sense. And in a number of passages, however, the word involves the idea of transgressing a command or going beyond the established limit. So again, God in his holiness, in his perfect, in his perfection, he expects obedience to his law, and transgressing it means to go beyond the command. So that's what we got there. Another one is iniquity or lack of integrity. And the basic concept here seems to be a deviation from a right course. And so, you think about in a lot of stories, what was I thinking about? The Lord, I always think about the Lord of the Rings when we talk about this deviation from the right course. There's this scene in the old movies. I can't remember if it's in the book or not, but in the Fellowship of the Ring, the Fellowship ends up in is it Lorien? Is that what it's called? I can't remember. But Galadriel says, the quest stands on the edge of a knife. To walk either way would be to totally fall away. Think of it as like you don't want to deviate off that course. You have to stay on course. You have to stay in the right place. Otherwise, everything falls off into peril. And so this iniquity or lack of integrity, as Millard Erickson is trying to talk about here, it's God has a moral course. He's got a path that he has chosen morally for his people, and to be iniquitous, I guess that would be the word, or to lack integrity would be to deviate from that course. Another one is rebellion. A number of Old Testament words depict sin as rebellion, and that's actually a very prominent way in Hebrew thinking in the Old Testament. This is something that I've talked about many times. I often talk about sin as missing the mark and as rebellion, and I think these are probably two of the most prominent ways to talk about it. But all persons are assumed to be in contact with the truth of God, even Gentiles who do not have special revelation. But failure to believe the message, particularly when openly and specially presented, is disobedience or rebellion. And so we talk about that. So anyone who disobeys a king, for example, is his enemy. Likewise, anybody who disobeys the revelation of God is God's enemy. They're rebellious. And so, again, Paul talks about this numerous times in the New Testament. In Romans, he will talk about how Israel has rebelled against God, but he also talks about how the Gentiles have rebelled against God because God has written the word on the Gentiles' heart, and they rebel. They rebel against that word written on their hearts, and so that's one way to look at it. Another way is treachery. Closely related to the concept of sin as rebellion is the sin as a breach of trust or treachery. This is common in the Hebrew sense, and it's also in the New Testament. In both Testaments, there's a focus upon the bond or covenant between God and his people. The people in the covenant enjoy a relationship with God, or at least have been introduced to the things of God, and God has entrusted them with an exceptional gift, mainly his covenant, and then it's broken. The sin of betrayal or treachery or infidelity to that trust is appropriately labeled treachery. It is especially reprehensible because of what has been violated, mainly the covenant. Another way that Erickson brings out sin is perversion, to bend or twist. And so this literally, let's see here, to bend or twist, the basic meaning is uh, so he uses the image of God as an example, is that when sin is not merely an isolated act, but an act of an actual alteration of the condition or character of the sinner. And so the true nature for which and in which the human was created, the image and likeness of God is twisted or disturbed, and this is both a result and cause of sin. So again, it's a little bit difficult to understand, but a perversion. So when we understand a lot of classical philosophy talks about evil as a perversion of good. And so when we think of sin, what is sin in the human life a lot of times? When we think of sexual sin or sins that we use to gratify ourselves, like gluttony, for example, well, it's not that sex is necessarily in and of itself bad. It's what we do to pervert it that makes it sin. It's not that food or drink in and of themselves are bad. We need food to survive. We need water to survive. But we also can, from time to time, enjoy a little alcohol. Doesn't mean they are bad within themselves. What it means is that they have been perverted and used in a way that really elevates what God has given above God. We are worshiping the thing more than the creator, more than the person who's actually given them to us. And so this idea of twisting or perverting something that God has given us, something good that God has given us, and we have turned it around and made it evil. We've used it for evil. And so that's a very common way that we think of sin today, especially in sexual sin. I grew up in the purity culture and the low church Protestantism of the 1990s. It was all this I kiss dating goodbye stuff, and it was just all this don't ever touch anybody, anyone ever, whatever. But a lot of that culture really gave a bad painting of what human sexuality was like. It gave just a really bad understanding of the beautiful relationship that a man and woman within marriage can have as far as sexuality goes. And what we do is we take that misunderstanding and then we pervert, sexuality and what it's supposed to be in biblical terms, and we pervert it and we twist it into something else that is just ugly and sinful. And so that's a huge way of sin, and we do that a lot. The last one, talking about the nature of sin, is abomination. This characterization of sin as abomination appears to have special reference to God's attitude towards sin and its effect upon him. Let's see, abomination is the most common English translation. Uh, Mostly has to do with sexual sin. These practices virtually nauseate God. The term abomination indicates that these sins are not simply something that God peevishly objects to, but that produces revulsion in him. So you want to get into that a little more. I'm not going to get into it too much because it does talk about, about actually sexuality as idolatry. And there's also some Old Testament references to when the Hebrews were sacrificing their sons and daughters to Molech and in witchcraft. God, the term for sin here is abomination, and it's a revulsion. When it comes to God, he's it produces revulsion in him. So those are different terms that talk about the nature of sin. So real quick, just going back over those again: missing the mark, irreligion, transgression, iniquity or lack of integrity, rebellion, treachery, perversion, and abomination. Now we're going to into some terms that talk about, and I want to go over these real quick because I want to get into the essential nature of sin. I think that's more in line with what we want to talk about here. Let's see. Terms emphasizing the results of sin. Some terms focus neither upon the predisposing factors that give rise to sin, nor upon the nature of the act itself, but rather upon the consequences that follow it. Agitation or restlessness. This is, let's see, yeah, it produces restlessness in the limbs. In the Old Testament, it talks about wickedness sometimes to be disjointed or ill-regulated and normal wicked. This is a very literal translation. Yeah, living in chaotic confusion and bring similar disorder into the lives of those who choose this kind of sin. So the result, this agitation or restlessness, is the idea that once you choose the sin, the consequences, a life of chaos and confusion, disorder in the life. I think we can definitely see that and speak to it today. Evil or badness. Let's see, evil in the sense of badness. Thus, it can refer to anything that is harmful or malignant, not merely the moral evil. So it's not just moral evil; it's anything is that we would see as bad. So a dangerous animal, for example, we would call maybe natural evil in philosophy. Like what is a tornado? Well, it's not directly caused by sin, but we have sin in the world. Um, this word then binds together the act of sin and its consequences. Um, Evil has entered the world because of this, and we see this just general sense of evil or badness. So that's kind of vague. Uh, Again, if you want to get Erickson's book and look it up, again, this is a great book. I would recommend any student of theology would jump into this. And the last one, guilt. Oh, this is one that nobody wants to talk about because we're not supposed to feel guilty, not supposed to feel shame about anything. We're supposed to just look in ourselves and be proud of who we are. The idea in this case and in many others is that harm has been done by the act of sin, and there must be some form of restitution. Yeah, the sinner is liable for punishment for offending God. They feel this sense of trouble within them. So, a consequence is guilt. And it's not just a feeling, it's actually, something that is put upon them by the law. People are guilty before the law. And then, one more, trouble. Trouble, almost always in a moral sense, the underlying idea is that sin brings trouble upon the sinner. So it's not just, trouble follows a sinful nature with that. So Those again are the consequences of sin. Yeah, I don't want to go into them too much. Buy Erickson's book. It's a great investment. Christian Theology. Okay, talks about all the different ways we can, different words you can use to describe sin biblically. Now, what we really want to get into is the essential nature of sin. This is what we want to talk about a little bit. So we have seen that there is a wide variety of terms for sin, each emphasizing a somewhat different aspect. But it is possible in the midst of this bewildering variety to formulate some comprehensive definition of sin to identify the essence of sin. We have seen that sins are variously characterized in the Bible as unbelief, rebellion, perversity, missing the mark. But what is sin? A common element running through all these varied ways of characterizing sin is the idea that the sinner has failed to fulfill God's law. So this is going to be one way. There are various ways to which we fail to meet the standard of righteousness. All right. We may go beyond the limits imposed or transgress. We may simply fall short of the standard set or not do at all what God commands and expects. Or we may do the right thing, but for a wrong reason, fulfilling thus fulfilling the letter of the law, but not its spirit. Okay, so what's he saying? So in some ways where we sin, it's characterized by failing to live up to God's law. And we do this in a couple ways. We may go beyond the imposed limits of God's law and break the law, or we may follow the law but do it for the wrong reasons. Well, what does that mean? Well, we follow God's moral command not because we want to glorify Him and obey God and worship Him. We follow it because we want to make ourselves feel good. So again, that's what we're talking when Erickson says here. We follow the letter of the law, but we don't follow the spirit of the law. In the Old Testament, sin is to a large extent a matter of external actions or outward lack of conformity to the requirements of God. Inward thoughts and motives are not completely ignored in the Old Testament conception, but in the New Testament they become especially prominent, being virtually as important as actions. So Jesus condemned anger and lust as vehemently as he did murder and adultery. He also condemned outwardly good acts done primarily out of desire to obtain approval of humans rather than to please God. Yet, sin is not merely wrong acts and thoughts, but sinfulness as well, an inherent inner disposition inclining us to wrong acts and thoughts. We are not simply sinners because we sin because we are sinners. So, what does he mean by that? So, Erickson is saying, yes, we do these acts and we call them sin. All right, but we have this inner disposition, this rebellious nature. And this is why I said earlier that you don't have to teach kids how to lie, cheat, steal, any of that. They're born with it. I have children of my own. I did not teach them to hit each other. I did not teach them to lie to me. I did not teach them to steal. I tried to teach them to do the opposite of that. I didn't have to teach them, but they've done it. They've done it to me. They've done it to their siblings. You are born with this sinful nature. And that's what he's trying to get across here. It's not just these wrong acts. Because if it was just wrong acts and we followed the letter of the law, then we would get into this idea that it's everybody outside of me. And I just have to think of sin like a sinfulness, or I just have to think of sin like something that's done to me rather than what I've done. And I just have to sit around and feel sorry for myself and go to therapy. That's not what sin is. That's not what the Bible teaches. We're talking about something that is innate within you when you are born. It requires radical transformation. So we are not simply sinners because we sin. So just because I sin does not mean I'm a sinner. He says we sin because we are sinners. We are born that way, and therefore we do what we were born to do with this sin nature. That's what he means by that. And so if we look at sin through that lens, that's when the gospel shines forth, because it requires that radical transformation. That's why, again, and I brought this up earlier, that's why it says, I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live. It is no longer that sin nature that lives in me, but it is Christ who lives in me. And so, and you see this all the time today when you have more conservative pastors and ministers who will take a stand against any kind of way people want to live their lives today, whether that's some kind of sexual preference, whether that is just some kind of sin they want to live in. And you see it on social media all the time. God would never want me to deny who I am. That is the exact opposite of what the New Testament says. That is an absolute lie. That is a lie of the enemy, and it is dragging people straight to hell. That is not what the gospel message is. The gospel message is that you and I are not good enough, that we cannot live up to the holy standard of God, and therefore we need someone to take that away from us. We need someone else who did live up to that standard. And so all these people who want to talk about, God would never want me to deny who I am deep down. That's just a lie. That's not biblical. And I mean, what you would ultimately have to do is you would have to deny what the scriptures say in order to uphold that. And maybe they do. Maybe that's what they do. I don't know. So we offer then, continuing with Erickson, we offer then this definition of sin. Sin is any lack of conformity, active or passive, to the moral law of God. This may be a matter of act, of thought, or of inner disposition or state. So let me read that again. Sin is any lack of conformity, active or passive, to the moral law of God. That is, or this may be a matter of act or thought, or of inner disposition or state. Sin is a failure to live up to what God expects of us in act, thought, and being. We must still ask at this point, however, whether there is one basic principle of sin, one underlying factor that characterizes all of sin in its manifold varieties. Several suggestions have been made. All right, and this is where he's going to talk about what other theologians have suggested. Sensuality. One suggestion is that sin is sensuality. According to this conception, sin is the tendency of the lower or physical nature to dominate and control the higher or spiritual nature. This takes Paul's warnings against living according to the flesh quite literally and bases sin in the physical or material aspect of the human. This conception is also prominent in the thought of Augustine, in his case, growing out of his own struggle with sensuality. He references Augustine's Confessions, chapter 2, on that, or book 2 on that. It's Confessions is broken up into books with different chapters in there. So if you've never read the Confessions before, you should. As appealing as this view is because of its simplicity, it nonetheless has significant shortcomings. For one thing, it seems to disregard the fact that many sins, and perhaps the worst sins, are not physical in nature. So what he's saying here is that some people have tried to characterize sin as pure sensuality or acting according to the flesh. This kind of disregards the fact that many sins are not physical in nature. And so in Paul's famous catalog of sins in Galatians 5:19 through 21, many are indeed works of the flesh in the literal sense: sexual immorality, impurity, debauchery, drunkenness, and orgies. But several are definitely more spiritual, he said spiritual, in nature: hatred, discord, jealousy, fits of rage, selfish ambition, dissensions, factions, and envy. The view that sin is sensuality has to maintain that contact of the soul or spirit with a corrupted body produces these spiritual sins. But at this point, the meaning of sensuality seems to have been stretched excessively. So, see, the idea that sin is essentially sensuality is a misunderstanding of flesh, especially as Paul uses the term. And I think we see that, again, I grew up in 90s purity culture, all right? And I think we see that in that kind of culture where it's only sensuality, And I remember when I was like in my early and mid 20s, when I was a camp counselor, like a high school camp counselor, and we would sit the boys down and we'd have the sex talks with them, and we'd say, look, you can't be doing this stuff. You can't be engaging in this kind of sin. And their questions were always about how close can I get to the physical act without actually sinning. And the whole point we would try to make is, listen, it's not necessarily about getting right up to the line. It's where your mind is. It's not just about this sensual physical act. It's where's your mind? That's why Jesus says, if any man looks at another woman with lust in his heart, he sinned. And that's what we were trying to get these young boys to understand is it's not just what you're doing physically, it's where your mind is. So this idea of sensuality very much plays into that. And so we can't just think of sensuality as sin. We can't just think of sin as sensuality. It has to be more than that. A second view is that sin is essentially selfishness, the choice of self as the supreme end, which constitutes the antithesis of supreme love to God. Again, he's quoting Augustus Strong there in his systematic theology. This view was held by Augustus Strong and in somewhat different form by Reinhold. I can't ever say this last name, Niebuhr. I think that's what it is. Contended that pride, hubris, is the major form of human opposition to God. Now I can see that there might be some good points there. But let's continue with what Erickson says. According to Strong, selfishness, the preference of oneself to God, may reveal itself as many forms: sensuality, unbelief, enmity toward God. Thus, sin in whatever form is selfishness. It is preferring one's own ideas to God's truth, or the satisfaction of one's own will to doing God's will, or loving oneself more than God. The enthronement of God from his rightful place as Lord of one's life requires enthroning something else, and this is understood to be the enthronement of oneself. Here again is a view that has much to commend. It certainly strikes a responsive note in the thinking of many of us, for we know that selfishness holds a firm grip on our lives and induces us to commit many sins. Yet there is one major problem with this view. Some of what we do cannot really be characterized as selfish in a strict sense, yet sinful. For example, there are those who sin against God not by loving themselves more than they love God, but by loving some other person more, or by giving their lives for a cause that is opposed to that of God. It might, of course, be countered that this is what brings such people satisfaction. Suffering or death is what really meets their selfish needs and desires, but this counter argument would involve defining selfishness in such an elastic way that nothing could possibly count against the theory that selfishness is the essence of sin, in which case the theory would be a meaningless statement. So what he's saying there is that there are, in some senses, where people will love a cause or a person more than God, and that does not necessarily count as selfishness. And if we try to say that it's a sense of selfishness, then we really made this theory so broad that it really loses all meaning. So what he's saying is we cannot think of sin entirely as selfishness, even though some other theologians, very good theologians, by the way, who have tried to do so. Then he gives his preferable alternative. This preferable alternative is called displacement of God. And this is where we will end the chapter and end our discussion of this tonight. A preferable alternative to these two views is that the essence of sin is simply failure to let God be God. It is placing something else, anything else, in the supreme place, which is his. Thus, choosing oneself rather than God is not wrong because self is chosen, but because something other than God is chosen. Choosing any finite object over God is wrong, no matter how selfless such an act might be. Now, this is pretty good, because when you think about, if we're trying to give a broad general sense of what sin is, he already talked about the problems of trying to use sensuality, and that not all all sins are sensual. He talked about, selfishness. Well, not all sins are selfish necessarily. But if we talk about sin as displacement of God, as we are taking God from his rightful place and then putting something else there, well, that seems to cover all of our bases. It's broad enough to where um, we can understand sin in that general sense. This contention is supported by many major texts in both the Old and New Testament. The Ten Commandments begin with the command to give God his proper place. You shall have no other gods before me, is the first prohibition in the law. Similarly, Jesus affirmed that the first and great commandment is love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. Mark 12:30. Proper recognition of God is primary. Idolatry in any form, not pride, is the essence of sin. Now that's interesting because a lot of people will say, well, pride is the root of all evil, but he is arguing here that idolatry, and I think we kind of get that in the Old Testament when we look at the Ten Commandments, because again, it starts with, you shall have no other God before me. Idolatry in any form is the essence of sin. It is the nature of sin. One might ask what the major factor in our failure to love, worship, and obey God is. I submit that it is unbelief. Anyone who truly believes God to be he what he says he is will. Let me read that again because that was really bad. All right. I submit that it is unbelief. Anyone who truly believes God to be what he says he is will accord to him his rightful status. Failure to do so is sin. So failure to believe God and who he says he is sin. That's what he's saying there. Setting one's own ideas above God's revealed word entails refusal to believe it to be true. Seeking one's own will involves believing that one's own values are actually higher than those of God. In short, it is failing to acknowledge God as God. And so this is the big thing here. This is the big thing here. Some of you are saying my audio is difficult to hear. Well, that's no good because I'm an hour and 20 minutes into this. So hopefully you guys are able to hear it. Oh, is the audio connected to the webcam mic? Well, I was hoping it was to the I was hoping it was to this mic. It's giving me full bars, guys. Like when I talk, it's so weird. Oh, maybe it's not. All right. Well, we will try again some other time then. That's all I had anyway. So maybe it was only going off of my maybe it was only going off of my webcam mic. Hold on. This is a rookie mistake. I'm so upset now. I'm like the worst person to be doing this stuff. Will says he'll find some headphones to listen. All right. Well, sorry about that, guys. It's weird, man. It says my microphone's on. It says my microphone's on, and that I can see the bars moving in the bottom. Anyways, that's all I got, guys. I've been on here for an hour and a half. I'm ready to be done. So, yeah, I just read through Millard Erickson's Christian Theology, the chapter on the nature of sin. Wanted to talk about the things in there, and I think I'm going to do more of those. So I will see you guys later. Have a good night.